Now we're going to talk about planning for messaging deployments. One of the first questions to address when planning a new Microsoft 365 messaging deployment is where the solution will be implemented. One option is cloud only. In this scenario, all user mailboxes are hosted in Azure data centers through Exchange Online, and the admin has no on-premises messaging infrastructure to deploy or manage. Another possibility is Exchange Hybrid. In this case, some mailboxes are hosted on premises on an Exchange server deployment, while other mailboxes are hosted in Exchange Online. This can be beneficial for certain usage profiles, for example, in cases with limited bandwidth or sporadic connectivity. A baseline prerequisite for any messaging deployment is to verify network connectivity, which includes ensuring that the correct ports are open on your firewalls. The bottom line is that in most scenarios, both online and on-prem components will require access to TCP ports 25 and 443. All internet-enabled mail requires configuration of MX records in the organization's DNS. MX records can be set up to point to Exchange Online, on-prem, or intermediate SMTP servers. Microsoft recommends that you configure your MX records to point to Exchange Online protection in Microsoft 365. This is because it allows you to take advantage of Microsoft's services that filter spam, malware, and other undesirable mail traffic. For a DNS domain to work with your Exchange tenant, it must be set up as an accepted domain with appropriately configured MX records. There are two types of accepted domain. Authoritative domains are the normal kind. With authoritative domains, incoming email will be delivered to email addresses that are configured for recipients for this domain. Email to unknown recipients will be rejected. This configuration is appropriate as long as all recipients are using Microsoft 365 or your organization's own email servers. With relay domains, email is delivered using a Mailflow connector to another mail server. Exchange will not generate bounce messages if a recipient doesn't exist. This kind of solution is appropriate if some members of your organization are not using Microsoft 365, and in cases where mail must be forwarded to mail servers that you don't control. There are certain factors that will heavily influence your choices when planning a strategy for migrating to Exchange Online. For example, recall from earlier in the course that there are different strategies available for different circumstances. Each migration strategy has its pluses and minuses. Cutover migrations are appropriate for migrating small numbers of mailboxes to a purely cloud-based solution. Staged migrations can be used for migrating small numbers of Exchange 2007 or 2010 mailboxes. Stage migrations can also be used for larger numbers of Exchange 2007 or 2010 mailboxes in a hybrid scenario, as can remote move migrations in hybrid deployment. Remote move migrations in hybrid deployment are also applicable to migrating later editions of Exchange, and IMAP migrations are intended for migrating non-Exchange on-premises messaging systems. An Exchange hybrid deployment is where an on-prem Exchange environment coexists with Exchange Online. In this kind of environment, user accounts are managed using on-premises tools. Directory synchronization is used to connect the on-premises Exchange organization with Exchange Online. Users can use single sign-on to access their mailbox, whether the mailbox is hosted on-premises or online. Email is routed securely between the on-premises Exchange deployment and Exchange Online. And FreeBusy calendar sharing is available for users with mailboxes hosted in the on-premises Exchange organization and mailboxes hosted in Exchange Online. To implement a hybrid deployment, there are some basic requirements. For an Exchange 2010 hybrid deployment, you must have at least one Exchange 2010 server with the mailbox, hub transport, and client access server roles installed, and your auto-discover public DNS records must point to the on-premises client access server. For an Exchange 2013 hybrid deployment, you must have at least one server with the mailbox and client access roles installed, and your auto-discover public DNS records must point to the on-premises client access server. And for an Exchange 2016 or 2019 hybrid deployment, you must have at least one server with the mailbox server role installed, and your auto-discover public DNS record must point at the on-premises mailbox server. In addition to the previously mentioned requirements, hybrid deployments require that Azure AD Connect must be configured to sync on-prem AD to Azure AD. Any custom domains must be registered with your Azure AD tenancy. Your Microsoft 365 organization must be connected to the Exchange Admin Center, and any IIS instances on your Exchange servers must have valid digital certificates configured. In a cutover migration, all on-prem mailboxes are migrated to Exchange Online in a single batch. This type of migration is suitable when all mailboxes will be hosted in Microsoft 365. User accounts will be managed using Microsoft 365 tools. The migration should be performed in less than 1 week. The organization has fewer than 2,000 mailboxes. Your on-premises messaging solution is Exchange Server 2007 or later, which will hopefully not be a concern since Exchange Server 2007 reached end of extended support on April 11, 2017. And the primary domain name used for on-premises Exchange deployment can be configured as a domain associated with a Microsoft 365 tenancy. Here's a high-level summary of the steps involved in doing a cutover migration. Start by creating empty mail-enabled security groups in Microsoft 365. Then create a migration endpoint. And then you're ready to create and start a cutover migration batch using the Exchange Admin Center or Windows PowerShell. When the batch is triggered, Exchange Online then queries the on-premises Exchange deployment's address book to identify mailboxes, distribution groups, and contacts, provisions new Exchange Online mailboxes, creates distribution groups and contacts within Exchange Online, migrates mailbox data from each on-premises mailbox to the corresponding Exchange Online mailbox, and then forwards the administrator a report providing statistics, including the number of successful and failed migrations. At this point, incremental synchronization will occur every 24 hours, updating Exchange Online with any new items created in the on-premises mailboxes. Once you verify that this process worked, you can change the MX records to point to Exchange Online, delete the cutover migration batch, which terminates synchronization between the on-premises mailboxes and Microsoft 365, and then perform post-migration tasks, including assigning Microsoft 365 licenses, creating an auto-discover DNS record, and decommissioning your on-premises Exchange servers. A minimal hybrid or express migration keeps on-prem and online mailboxes in sync during migration. This kind of migration is appropriate when your on-prem install is Exchange 2010 or later, your migration timetable is less than a few weeks, and when no ongoing directory service configuration is intended. Here's a high-level overview of the minimal hybrid or express migration process. First, in the Microsoft 365 console, you add the domain used by your on-premises Exchange organization by configuring a DNS TXT record. Then sign into Microsoft 365 as a global administrator and start the Exchange Hybrid Configuration Wizard from the data migration page under Setup in the Microsoft 365 admin console. Connect to the on-premises Exchange server organization, choose the minimal hybrid configuration option, select the option to synchronize users and passwords one at a time. At this point, you will be prompted to install Azure AD Connect with the default options, and then synchronization will occur once and then be turned off. Configure Microsoft 365 licenses for migrated users, and then begin migrating user mailbox data, and finally, update DNS MX records to point away from the on-premises Exchange deployment to Exchange Online. The remote move migration method has been used with existing hybrid deployments to move mailboxes from on-prem to Exchange Online. To use this kind of process, a hybrid deployment must already exist between your on-premises Exchange organization and Exchange Online. It must be performed by an account that has the organization management or recipient management role, and the mailbox replication proxy service must be deployed on all on-premises Exchange 2013 or Exchange 2016 client access servers. And here's a high-level overview of the remote move migration method. You start by creating a migration endpoint. Migration endpoints host connection settings for on-prem Exchange servers that are running the MRS proxy service. Then you enable the MRS proxy service, which is hosted on on-prem client access servers, then move the mailboxes. This can be done via the Office 365 tab in EAC on the on-premises Exchange server by creating a new migration batch in Exchange Admin Console or with PowerShell. Mailboxes are moved in groups called batches. Then remove the completed migration batches using the Exchange Administration Center or Windows PowerShell, and re-enable offline access for the Outlook web app. If users have been migrated from on-premises Exchange server to Office 365, offline access settings must be re-enabled in their browser. In a staged migration, you migrate mailboxes from your on-prem Exchange servers to Exchange Online in groups. Staged migrations are appropriate when there are more than 2,000 mailboxes on-prem in Exchange 2003 or 2007. The plan is to cut over completely to Exchange Online. The time frame is several or more weeks. After the migration, the plan is for user accounts to be managed on-prem and synced with Azure AD, and the primary on-prem domain is configured as a domain in Microsoft 365. And here's a high-level summary of the staged migration method. Start by creating one CSV file per batch with a row for every user to be migrated. Then, create a staged migration batch using the Exchange Admin Center or PowerShell. Trigger the migration batch. Exchange Online will then verify that directory synchronization is enabled and functioning, verify that a mail-enabled user exists in Office 365 for every user in the CSV file, convert each user in the file from an Office 365 mail-enabled user to an Exchange Online mailbox, configure mail forwarding for the on-premises mailbox, and Exchange Online then sends a status report. Then convert the mailboxes of successfully migrated on-premises users to mail-enabled users in the on-premises Exchange deployment, configure a new batch of users to migrate and delete the current batch, and after all users have been migrated, assign licenses to Office 365 users, configure MX records to point to Exchange Online, and create an auto-discover record that points to Office 365. Finally, decommission the on-premises Exchange deployment. IMAP migrations use the IMAP protocol to move mailbox data. These are suitable for non-Exchange mail systems such as Courier IMAP, Cyrus, Dovecot, and UW IMAP. It's also useful for online systems like Outlook.com. Here's a high-level summary of an IMAP migration. You start by creating Microsoft 365 user accounts and assigning them Exchange Online user licenses. This must be completed by a tenant administrator. Then create a CSV file that includes a row for each on-premises user who will be migrated to Exchange Online using IMAP. This must also be completed by a tenant administrator. Create and trigger an IMAP migration batch using the migration dashboard. Once the migration batch is initiated, Exchange Online does the following: creates a migration request for each user in the CSV file, copies messages from each user's IMAP mailbox to the corresponding Exchange Online mailbox until all data is migrated, provides a status email to the administrator informing them of the status of the migration. Exchange Online and the IMAP messaging system are synchronized every 24 hours to move any new messages from the on-premises environment to Exchange Online. Once all batches have been processed, update the MX records to point to Exchange Online, and finally, delete the migration batches.